Hey all, it's your boy Cryptic, and today we've got a new video. This time we're going to be talking about the performance between the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. It's been coming up lately as to why these two consoles are performing so differently to what a lot had expected, especially looking at the specifications on paper. So we're going to get into it, and I'm probably going to, well, try to at least bring up some points that I feel like a lot of people have left out in the discussions and their um, reports, etc. And sort of as I'm talking about it, you'll see some snippets in the video of what I'm talking about in regards to the feature sets of both machines and sort of why things might be turning out the way they are. So, guys, if you can, if you've got a chance, hit the like button, click subscribe if you haven't hit subscribe, leave a comment if you want to leave your 2 cents into this discussion, and hopefully we can keep the flame wars out of it and console wars out of it and just have a legitimate discussion as to why the consoles are the way they are at the moment. With that out of the way, this video is going to be about the reason why a lot of people are surprised as to the PlayStation 5 punching above its weight, spec-wise, on a whole bunch of games, predominantly third-party titles. As you know, the consoles will always perform better in first-party titles as the developers pretty much get, red carpet treatment to any tool sets, early availability to development kits, updates, tools, etc., to make their games look as good as and perform as good as possible on the hardware, since it is an exclusive. It's meant to show off the power of the console. Now, recently we've had reviews and releases of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Dirt 5, Devil May Cry, etc. On the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox. And on paper, the Xbox should be outperforming the PS5 on all fronts, resolution, frame rate, etc. But here's the thing, it hasn't at all. Especially when it comes to the higher frame rates, hitting 60 FPS and higher towards 120 FPS. The PlayStation 5 has actually been outperforming the Xbox. And in some instances, if you look especially into Assassin's Creed Valhalla, although it doesn't have any actual ray tracing, the resolution scale to frame rate, so on the PlayStation 5, Assassin's Creed Valhalla actually hits 4K and stays at 4K at a, a stable FPS, a lot more so than the Xbox, by a lot. There are some instances where, especially when you hit the 120 FPS mark, the PlayStation 5 is outperforming the Xbox Series X by upwards of 40 frames per second, which is a huge difference. Again, when you're going down from 120 frames down towards 60, it's not that jarring or that noticeable as you're going from 60 down towards 30. There are a lot more frames that you're still seeing compared to 60. You're seeing a lot more than 60 frames per second on your eyes, so the drop from that high is a lot less noticeable than 60 and below. But a lot of people are going, how's that even possible? Isn't the Xbox Series X meant to be a lot more powerful? The GPU is meant to be, a whole lot better than the PlayStation 5's GPU, even though they're both using AMD, teraflops, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of people have sort of taken the whole teraflops calculation completely wrong. Teraflops is a very generic way to sort of emphasize or calculate compute performance for any piece of hardware. It doesn't tell you the full story, and not even close. The best way I'm going to try and explain potentially why the PlayStation 5 is so far, and I do mean so far, outperforming the Xbox, and the reasons that Microsoft is saying that, hey, this is why we're not performing as well as we'd like to be or as we thought we'd be. I think their answer is also a bit bullish, but we'll get into that into the video. So, like I said, teraflops is just a very generic in technology, very generic way to emphasize compute performance. Just because you have a higher teraflop number does not necessarily mean you're going to perform better in similar actions as something that has less teraflop number in the GPU. So for those that know, the Xbox Series X is rated at 12 teraflops for the GPU, while the PlayStation is at 10.28 or 10.3 teraflops, but with a variable frequency. Now, here's the thing. The variable frequency on the PlayStation 5 is the key as to why I honestly believe that it is outperforming the Xbox currently. But we'll definitely get into this. The Xbox is locked at its frequencies and power on the GPU and CPU. They don't really overclock, they don't underclock. Power delivery doesn't really change between the CPU and the GPU to give more or less priority to any component. They're sort of like it's either on or it's off. It's all there or it's not all there. Very simple, right? Which is fair. Most computers, right, like your PC you build, you have the full use of your GPU and CPU. Whether the application you're running utilizes that full amount, that's entirely up to the application, which is the most traditional way of actually building a program. You know, if you're building for a particular platform, you know where the ceiling is, what the performance ceiling is, and where you sort of have to hit your targets to get a stable application, stable frame rate, stable performance. And if you're drawing more resources than what you actually have, thermal throttling kicks in, bottlenecks happen, etc. But I do believe in some instances at the moment the Xbox might be bottlenecked in potentially CPU. Now, if your computer is CPU bottlenecked, right? So whatever application is running is pinning the CPU at 100% usage across all cores. And then you look at your GPU percentages, especially if you use Afterburner or CPU-Z, etc., to sort of monitor the thermals, statistics, loads, etc., right? Of your CPU and GPU. It'll pretty much tell you if your CPU is pinned and then your GPU is only at 50 to 75% utilization, you are CPU bottlenecked. Your CPU is holding back your GPU in this particular application because this application is a lot more CPU intensive. Also, vice versa, if your GPU bottlenecked, where your GPU is pinned to 100% and your CPU is, let's say, 50, 60% utilization across all its cores. So that application there is more GPU intensive as opposed to being CPU intensive. And that's why you're not getting the best performance possible. Which leads me to believe what the Xbox currently is potentially suffering with is the CPU underpowered for the unit. On paper, it's not. On paper, if it's underpowered for the application, then so should the PS5 CPU. But here's the difference where, again, I was going to say to overclocking and variable frequencies on the PlayStation 5, which the Xbox doesn't do, it doesn't utilize. If you look at Mark Cerny's Road to PlayStation 5 video, which I know copped a bit of flack because it was very technical, right? It didn't show off the console, people hated it, but it was really is for the developers, right? What they were going to get out of the PlayStation 5, out of the dev kits, out of the final console on release. And there were a lot of information that I think people either don't really notice how important these features are, especially right now. I mean, we're right on the cusp, literally 2 days away from Cyberpunk 2077 coming out, and that'll be a really good gauge of whether it was just the early jitters for the Xbox as to why it's underperforming compared to the PlayStation 5, or the trend will continue. We'll sort of know as everyone gets it on their hands because reviews have started coming out for Cyberpunk, but they're mostly on for PC with B-roll provided by CD Projekt Red as opposed to their actual gameplay recordings with their performance being recorded on their systems that they've played on. But Mark Cerny did say that with the PlayStation, it will, and developers can program the tolerances on these as they're developing their game on the dev kits. Depending on thermals and what component is required the most at any given time, whether it's the CPU or the GPU, and again on thermals as well. Power can be directed more towards the CPU or to the GPU to whatever is needed most importantly at that given time during the operation of the program, in this case, the game. So there potentially are instances where the GPU is really needed to, ramp up or the CPU needs to ramp up in clock speeds. And again, in video games, clock speeds are still our king. Most games, especially on PC, 4 to 6 cores with hyper-threading, right, is all they need. Anything more, it's a waste unless you're doing productivity things like rendering, 3D modeling, or intensive background tasks that involve compute, right? As opposed to gaming, where the compute performance is a lot less compared to real-time rendering, etc., modeling, programming, etc., all that kind of stuff. So if the GPU is going, hey, I need higher clock speeds to maintain this frame rate, or the CPU is like, hey, I need to help assist in populating more particle effects or NPCs on screen, so I need higher clock speeds to maintain this at this resolution to work with the GPU, and be like, all right, GPU is fine where it is. Let's get the extra resources of power and pump it into the CPU and boost those clocks up and maintain it. That's why a lot of people are now saying, like, if you look at the 4K resolution at especially particular scenes where Digital Foundry did the calculation, right, where it's like, hey, the PlayStation 5 right here, although exhibiting some tearing, again, the Xbox and the PS5 both exhibiting tearing unless you've got a variable refresh rate compatible TV or monitor, I guess, where it can maintain 4K at 30 FPS or 60 FPS, whatever sort of mode you have available right now in the settings, whether it be performance or fidelity, right? The PS5 is holding that almost perfect performance right there at that higher resolution. And then with the Xbox, it's plummeting. Frame rates are dipping hard. Resolution is having forced to go way lower. And even with the recent patch to Assassin's Creed Valhalla, you had a more stable frame rate on the Xbox side, but to achieve it, the Ubisoft needed to downgrade the overall resolution that it was upscaling from to reach 4K. So instead of being at something like 1440p or equivalent, it's doing it from 1080p. And the PS5 is like, hey, no changes in the patch there, because the PlayStation 5 was already performing well and continuing to perform better even post patch, which is insane. Again, like 10.28 teraflops to 12 was like, but it has more power. It just seems like the PlayStation 5 currently, and again, Microsoft said it's because they got their development kits out late to devs, because they were waiting for a specific Zen 2 technology from AMD for their console. It's like, this is where I'm going to say bullshit. You should be able to have within, especially with games coming out, let's say in 12 to 6 months time, and devs need to optimize for the new consoles, right? You should have your hardware locked in place, technology locked in place. Like, there has to be a cutoff at some point. You go, that's it, that's enough, that's the feature set we're going with. Like any game, same thing with hardware, and go, all right, we need to get this out. We need to go to mass production. We need to make sure we have enough units for launch and pre-orders, right? I mean, to say that they got it late and that's the reason why they didn't have enough time to optimize. Mostly Microsoft was saying that. I'm not saying that developers didn't agree with them. There might have been some developers who potentially did, but I don't think that's the case. Also, you got to remember when the road to PlayStation 5 also stated that one of their focus was to continue the trend with the PlayStation 4, where it made time to triangulate games or code onto the PlayStation 5 a lot quicker, a lot easier for developers, where it takes less than a month now, down from 1 to 2 months down to less than a month, which is, I think, so far the fastest since the original PlayStation, or even better than the original PlayStation. To make sure that code is running, you can get a test going and see what the performance is like with what you have so far. It's so quick. The optimization of the hardware with the interface, with the dev kits, etc., just seems at the moment superior on the PlayStation side compared to Xbox. Does that mean that Xbox has lost that develop? This is like the PlayStation 3 scenario all over again, where developers are going to find a super hard time to develop on the Series X? No. Does PlayStation potentially have an advantage with its variable clock speeds and power regulation between the CPU and GPU? Yes. Like you said, It's not just Sony controlling what can and can't be done with that. Developers have full access to that. If it's running, you're running their game and they need at certain scenes more GPU power here or more CPU here, right? Power there. They can program that in because it's going to make a more stable game. And I think that's a missed opportunity with Microsoft. I mean, they can brag that they're the only true Zen 2 and or Zen 3 or whatever they want to call it, right? Architecture for the current gen consoles. And Sony's using some, half mid-generation hybrid, but it seems like at the moment, hardware-wise and potentially software-wise, Sony is ahead. And it's not just like one game so far; it's majority of third-party titles. Um, which is insane. But if you think about it logically, also, if you look back to the Xbox One X and the PlayStation 4 Pro, both were touting 4K resolution, HDR, all this fancy stuff, and then it turned out, that down towards the end of the life cycle of both consoles, they sort of performed the same, regardless. Even though the Xbox One X was more powerful than the PS4 Pro, um, they ran the same on most games. I mean, they both ended up using some form of checkerboard rendering to achieve 4K, variable resolution, etc. And it didn't really matter, like, the slight GPU. I mean, if devs want something to run at a particular fidelity or frame rate and stable on a piece of hardware, they can achieve it. Devs are very versatile. They're got so many tricks up their sleeve and so much experience now, especially with how long it takes to develop a game compared to PS1, PS2, and even PS3 days. It takes so much longer now. You'll notice that so many more less games are made as each new generation is introduced because they take so much longer to develop and produce. So they have all that time to optimize their code and their games and to get them running at pretty much how they want them to or need them to on a particular platform. But if, you know, variable clock speeds and being able to control the power delivery to each component um, for the devs makes it a lot easier, which seems like it is, and potentially is the reason why the PS5 is outperforming the Xbox Series X. Then that's more power to the developers, which you want, because it makes their jobs a lot easier. They have a lot more finite control over how their code runs on a particular platform. But let's see when Cyberpunk drops. Let's see how Digital Foundry analyze, because they'll be all over that, trying to analyze the difference between PC, uh, base Xbox One, Xbox One X, Xbox Series X, Xbox Series S, PS4, PS4 Pro, and PS5. They're going to be all over it, and we'll see. Again, Cyberpunk, has been mostly advertised towards Microsoft's camp. Again, they have that partnership, for launch material, etc. But so was Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and look how that turned out performance-wise in regards on the PlayStation 5 compared to the Xbox. And it could potentially be that way, who knows? But all indications are, if this is a trend we've seen so far, even with the huge day one patch on Cyberpunk 2077, it might be the same case again. Um, but yeah, pretty much this video just wanted to go just over that particular set of features on the PlayStation 5 that a lot of people seem to skip and go, we don't know why it should have 12 teraflops. It doesn't tell you everything. On PCs, dual GPUs have been dying for so long. Like, more GPU cores or dual GPUs or high-end don't necessarily scale that well on CPU or a combination of hardware that is optimized for one thing, but you're trying to pump more frames out of it, and it's just a hot mess, right? You need harmony with the hardware. It needs to all make sense. It needs to have a particular scope and target in mind, and you have to aim for that. You can have a trick of all trades and a master of none, and then it does everything pretty average. Or you can go, you know what, we're going to be all about the IO throughput to get all the textures in, the models in, the world's loading, no loading screens, no pop in, seamless transition, assist with the frame rate, and a balanced CPU, GPU, and balancing out the requirements to clock speeds and power delivery. And go, that's how we're going to do it. We're just going to be optimum on speed and performance as best as we can. You know, no BS, no, um, you know, being top end heavy with the GPU and lacking in the CPU department or lacking in the clock speed department just by throwing more cores and more compute units at it. We're gonna do things in a more balanced manner that makes sense and makes things a lot easier to develop for and having a better overall experience in the end. Which seems like what Sony really focused on, and Microsoft was like, "Hey, we got the teraflops, let's go, teraflop nation." But with anything, as the months and years go on and games start coming out first party and third party, the devs will inevitably work out so many tricks and be able to utilize so much more of the hardware and the graphics engines within both of these consoles that I doubt we'll be seeing any difference compared to what we're seeing now. I mean, now the differences aren't huge because now it's gotten to the point where the games look almost identical, bar minor resolution and frame rate issues. Where once the devs get used to everything and know how the Xbox works and tap into more power into the PlayStation 5, they'll probably almost look like mirror images of themselves performing almost identical, bar very few exceptions. So yeah, if the last generation was anything to go by, people aren't going to notice any real differences between both consoles for third-party games. First party though, all depends on the first-party developers for each. Sony and Microsoft. As more talented they are, the more they'll get out of the consoles, and the more wowed we'll be. Because that's with the first-party titles coming out in 2021, I think there's some things to really be impressed by. Hopefully, if all indications are correct, that it's going to be some games achieving some, a level of graphical fidelity that we've never seen before, or even close to it, even on PC. So, yeah. Without further ado, guys, that's pretty much the video. Just wanted to talk about that aspect of everything, and hopefully it's sort of opened your mind and thoughts to a larger perspective that, just having large numbers on a spreadsheet and claiming that you're the most powerful X or Z thing here isn't going to mean that you're actually going to perform that well in the real world, because there's a lot of factors that a lot of benchmarks and tests don't account for. Anomalies and unoptimized code and unoptimized builds of software that, these synthetic tests that they can run on these systems before launch that will go like, hey, we should technically achieve this frame rate 8 or 9 times out of 10 without any issues. It's not always the case. There's too many variables out there, too many different styles of developing, coding, etc. So many different variable engines out there for games, and all forms of configurations of hardware on these consoles can, really perform in any form in such a large spectrum, from good, medium, bad. So yeah. Guys, thanks for watching. Upcoming videos will probably be on Cyberpunk. I will be getting it on launch day. Hopefully we'll get to do some videos on that, how it performs on the PS5, my thoughts on the game. I don't know if I'll do a review. It is a huge game. I will not be speedrunning through it. It's going to be one of those games that I just play throughout the entire, year of 2021 most likely, and just enjoy it along with other games that come out throughout 2021. But I'll probably give an overall impressions whether, it's something that's worth getting or not. Does it live up to expectations or to the hype? So yeah, hopefully if that's something you're looking forward to, that video will be for you. So yeah, guys, thanks for watching, and yeah, don't forget to like, subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell as well to make sure you get updated on any latest videos that I do post. And yeah, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.